So let's take a look at what we get inside our kit. So you get your ribbon for creating your hanging loops. You get a piece of red twill tape to create your garland. You get your Makawa stocking panel, and that is a beautiful panel printed on 100% cotton, featuring stockings in silver and red with metallic gold highlights. There's one for each day of Advent. And then you've got this Dashwood gold twist fabric to back them all. And the gold twist is nice because it goes with the gold highlights on your stockings, and it goes with both the red and the grey stockings. If we take a look at our panel here, we've got all of our stockings printed out. There's 24 in total. And then you've got some instructions in the top corner here. Now the first thing to do is to cut them all out, and you'll see that each stocking has a border with a dotted line. We're going to cut around the dotted lines for each of the stockings. Now because each stocking is going to need its own backing, what I like to do is to cut out the backing at the same time. So what you should do is take your backing fabric, and we've got, how much have we got of this? This is about 60 centimetres. So the panel is a 60 centimetre panel, and it's on quilter's cotton. So it's 112 centimetres wide, or 45 inches. So I take my backing fabric and I lay that out in front of me face down. So I'm looking at the wrong side there. Then I'll take my my panel with all my stockings on, and I'll lay that face up. So the wrong sides of the fabric are together. I can match up those selvages there. Smooth everything out. And then I think it's easy just to cut out the stockings and the backing fabric at the same time. The other way would be to cut out each stocking individually and then trace round it to cut out your backing fabric. But I actually think that they've laid the stockings out in quite a way that they're all squeezed together anyway. And it makes it a lot quicker if you can cut everything out in one go. So I've laid those two fabrics out together with wrong sides together, so right sides are facing outwards. And then what we can do is just take a couple of pins and pop a couple of pins in each stocking just to hold it together. And maybe one along the foot and one higher up. So once you've done that, then you can take your scissors and cut out each of your stockings, cutting through both layers of fabric so that you are cutting out your little piece of backing fabric at the same time. And of course they'll match up beautifully, and it saves the effort. With all of your offcuts, because you do have a little bit of wasted fabric in between, pop them all in a bag, and then if you ever need to stuff something, maybe you're making a little hanging decoration that needs stuffing, you can just chop up your offcuts into small pieces and use that as a stuffing. There we are. So there's my first stocking. I've got the backing fabric and the stocking itself. So you can do that for all 24. Now if you want, you can use scissors, or alternatively you can use your rotary cutter there, whichever you prefer. There's our second one. So don't worry if you leave a bit of white there. It doesn't matter really, because this red border just marks out your seam allowance, and we're going to trim that away when we turn the stockings right sides out anyway. So go ahead and cut out, by whichever method you prefer, all 24 of your stockings with their linings. So you should now have a pile of stockings all cut out with their backing fabric, and it's time to get on with a little bit of sewing. So you should find that you now have a pile of cut out stockings, each with their own backing piece or lining piece. So we're going to make each of the individual stockings, and I will show you how to make this one. And you're just going to repeat that same process for each of the 24 stockings. So you can either choose to do those in a kind of a production line, or you can do them one at a time, whatever you prefer. So in True Blue Peter style, here's one I made earlier. It's actually incredibly simple. We just attach the ribbon whilst sewing down the edge, and then put the stocking pieces right sides together, sew around, trim, turn through and press. So they are really, really easy and straightforward to make. Let's start by cutting a 15cm piece of our gold hanging ribbon. First thing you want to do is to fold that in half so that the raw edges of the ribbon meet. Place that on the inside edge of the stocking. So you want the hanging loop to come up here. And you don't want to catch that in the seam allowance here, so just make sure that you place that at the corner of your border there, so that it will come up in the corner of your stocking. You don't want it to be kind of right out hanging into that seam allowance, but you do want it to be kind of in the corner there. And we're just going to pop to the sewing machine and just sew that ribbon in place, just to hold it there for the next step. So you can see that my ribbon is folded in half with the raw edges meeting at the top there, and it's towards the corner of my panel. I just want to sew that in place. I'll just go back and forth. So you can see that I've just attached that to hold that ribbon in place. Now I've made a few of these different stockings using different techniques to see which I found the easiest, and the following technique is what I found to be the easiest way to make these stockings. So once you've attached that ribbon in place, I just fold the panel over and fold the red border down. It's 1/4 inch. So fold that down, give it a press. So you're not really folding into any of the design at the top edge of that stocking, but you're just getting rid of that red border at the top. And then you do the same on this one. So we just fold over by a tiny little amount at the top there. It's 1/4 inch. I'm doing it by eye. You can measure it if you like. I've now made a few of these. So I've got the knack. But basically you want it to be folding over by the same amount. So both these are the same. And so now that we've pressed those over, we're just going to take them to our sewing machine and stitch down that folded edge. So I want to stitch down this folded edge. I'm going to do so looking at the wrong side so that I can see that I'm definitely catching my folded over fabric. So I'm just using a regular universal needle, medium size, and a normal straight stitch, and I just want to sew that top edge down. I'm using white thread. Do a little back stitch at the beginning and the end. Repeat the same for my red fabric. Just make sure that that is going to catch the folded edge of my fabric. Try and keep this one nice and straight because this is obviously on the front, so it will show. You can use red thread if you want. I'm using white, or you could even use gold thread. And there you go. In fact, because the border where the number is white, then white is probably your best option there. So I want to trim any thread tails off. I want to do this as I go to keep it neat, especially if you are doing mass production. Keep a little bowl by your side for your thread offcuts. And here we go. So that's now nice and tidy, almost. Next thing to do is to put these right sides together, and we are just going to sew around the edge of our stocking, so they should match up nicely. Just want to make sure that they are matching up at the top. Hopefully if you've pressed over by the same amount, they will do. I shall pin or clip in place. You can use pins or clips, whichever you'd prefer. And in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch those over, those clips, because I think it's easier to sew looking at the red or the grey side of these stockings, because you can easily see where that 1 centimetre, or it's roughly just under a centimetre, it's 1/4 of an inch margin is. So from this side you can actually see where that border is, and it's on that border that we're now going to sew this stocking together. So we just want to start at the top edge there, a couple of back stitches, and then I'm just going to carefully follow where the print ends and the red border starts. Slowly does it around those curves, and you can just lift your presser foot, making sure that your needle is down, just to pivot the stocking shape around, so you get a nice shape. You don't want it to be sort of too jaggedy, you want a nice curve. And to get around these curves, you may want to even reduce your stitch length down slightly. I'm now at a stitch length of 2, because obviously when you're doing curves, a shorter stitch length is always easier to get round curves. And just take your time. The more that you do of these, the more experience you will get. So you could start off by doing the numbers that are at either extreme, the 1s, 2s and 23s and 24s, because then the focal point of your garland, if you're making a garland, will be in the middle, and you'll probably find that you improve as you go along. So you could start from the outside and then your middle stockings will be the prettiest. But yeah, it's really not difficult at all actually, this project. It's nice and beginner friendly. A little back stitch at the end. So there we go, we've sewn all the way around the edge of that stocking. We're now going to trim it down and turn it through. So there's my stocking all sewn together. Trim off any threads as always, and then we want to trim away some of the seam allowance to help it to turn through. So I want to trim down about half of the seam allowance there. So just following round. Oops. So that seam allowance is now trimmed down to about half. And then if you want to, just very carefully, and you don't want to snip your threads, you can just trim into any curves just to help that turn through as well. Anywhere where the curves are a little bit more extreme, just being careful not to colour your stitches, not to cut your stitches. You can see that I've just trimmed very carefully in there. If you kept your seam allowance quite narrow after trimming down, then you should find that it turns through okay. And with that done, we're ready now to turn our stocking through. Just switch my iron back on, turn everything through, and you can use a point turner or an edge shaper to just curve out those edges and get everything looking nice. This is a good project for little fingers if you want to get some help from the younger ones. They do like to get involved in some nice Christmas craft, so this is a great project for them. And you could even, because they're quite small, you could even do a couple of these stockings with hand stitching. So yeah, it's a great little project for any little sewing enthusiasts out there. Once you're happy that that's all turned through, then you just go ahead and give it all a press. And there is your stocking complete, ready to line up with all of its little friends there. And you want to repeat that process until you've made all 24 of your baby stockings. And I just think they look so pretty all together actually. When you're making them, you really get to look at all the gorgeous details that are printed onto the front. So you have a choice now. You can either leave them as they are, and I think that they would be quite fun to hang up on your Christmas tree. You could even quilt them onto a backing and make a quilt. I've actually got some red twill tape here, so I'm going to thread my stockings onto my twill tape to make a garland. And I want to leave a little bit of slack at the end of my twill tape there, so that if I wanted to tie it to something I could do. Once you've threaded all of your stockings onto your twill tape, you could either choose to use some festive red quilting clips, or you could use some of the pretty little pegs that you can buy from the craft stores and just secure your stockings in place, or you could space out your stockings appropriately and then stitch them in place if you'd prefer to do that. I'm just going to thread these on in one go to save time. So I'll get them on there and then I'll space them out. And I'm using about a 5 centimetre gap from one stocking to the next so that you can still see the numbers. So the stockings do overlap a little, but then when they're hung up, they will separate. And here is our beautiful garland, all finished and attached onto the tape. And you could use pegs or clips to attach them, or you could just then go in and do a little stitch to hold each stocking in its place. One last thing, with all these leftover offcuts that you've been keeping, my advice is to have some fun chopping them up into tiny pieces, and then you can use these if you make any hanging Christmas decorations, which I have a panel for that as well. Then you can use all these offcuts, which can't really be used for anything much else, to stuff your hanging decorations with, or if you're making toys, for example. And then you can just, I've got these bags left over from when things are delivered. Once that's all chopped up into tiny bits, you can pop it in a bag, and you've got a nice bag there of stuffing for if you're making any stuffed toys or decorations.